Hi, this is ToGather. I'm glad you joined us. I'm Phil Ware, and I write the devotionals for verseoftheday.com. We're glad you joined us, and I believe you're going to be blessed by today's message, which focuses on a passage from 1 John 3, verse 18. And our emphasis is love with actions and in truth. Real love acts. Now, the best way I know to get to the subject is to take you down a couple of memory windows. And so we're going to look at two memory windows. The memory window I want you to look at right now is right over here. You look down there and we'll go down that memory window. And that memory window involves a big oak table. It's a table that my mom bought when we lived in the country, and it was a great place for three boys and a husband and wife to have their meals. The problem was, at this meal, my dad wasn't present. He was sick and on the front end of 10 years of slowly dying. Mom had left him in the hospital. She came back. We had not done any of the chores or the things that we were supposed to do and she needed us to do, and we hadn't done our homework. She came in tired, exhausted, afraid, and sat down after she fixed dinner and had supper with us. And as we began to have supper, she began to ask how we had done at this set of things or that set of things or that set of things as we sat around that oak table. And then she said something that pierced our souls. I thought you boys said you loved me. We loved our mom. She had always been precious to us. She had given us range as boys to become who God made us to be. And now we realized we had broken her heart. The tears in her eyes brought tears to each of us, even though we tried not to show it. And being the oldest and feeling the heavy weight of her agony, I finally worked up enough courage to ask, I don't know what you mean, Mom. What do you mean we don't love you? And she said, how can you love me and not do what I ask? 50 years later, I still feel the sting of those words. And at different times in my life, I thought that was a pretty brutal thing to say. Except she was just channeling Jesus, wasn't she? When he asked his disciples, or told his disciples, if you love me, you'll do what I ask. She was carrying the weight of the world and of our family and of a future without her husband. And we hadn't done a couple of things she asked us to do. How could we say we loved her when we didn't do the basic, simplest things to demonstrate that love? It's still convicting to me. Now I want to take you down a memory window over here. We'll look at this little window. And it's a totally different kind of story with the same message. There was a widow in our congregation. She grieved the loss of her husband, but she could also laugh with an infectious laugh. And she was kind. But there was nothing about her that would say she was an evangelist. But one day, as she was coming back from the grocery store, she traveled down a busy street without a sidewalk. And there was an older woman who was dressed in clothes that indicated that she was not very well off financially. And she pulled up beside her, risking being hit from behind in busy traffic, and simply said, can I give you a ride home? This lady, carrying 12 or more of those plastic grocery bags, didn't understand her language, so Pat opened the door and the lady crawled in the front seat and put her bags in the back seat. Then she showed her where the apartment was, and it was refugee housing. It wasn't nice, but when she pulled up with this older woman, she was suddenly greeted by 10 or 15 young and old Bhutanese refugees. They welcomed her in. She loved them. She fell in love with them. And the bottom line of this story and this window over here was simply, that 3 years later, we could point to 153 Bhutanese refugees that took time to give up their many hundreds of gods in their old culture and proclaim Jesus is Lord and worship the one true and living God. And all of that was traceable back to Pat offering a ride and extending kindness. Over those 3 years, there were multiple kindnesses given. We began to teach English at our church using Let's Start Talking and Friends Speak, using the Gospel of Luke. People began to care for these people, invite them to their homes. We built Bible classes for the children so that they could be taught and brought into the mainstream of our church family. And being a pretty conservative church, we even opened the doors to once a quarter having celebrations where they would dance in beautiful, colorful robes, and someone would narrate the story of their journey to Christ in ways that folks out in West Texas had never seen before. It was glorious, and it all began because of one simple act of kindness and love by a widow. Now, what do these two stories have in common? What do these views out our memory windows have in common? They are rooted in a spiritual reality, an inescapable truth. What is that truth? Real love, Jesus-shaped love, agape-style love, is much more than just fancy words and fleeting sentiments. Real love is demonstrated in loving actions. And that's this week's verse of the day for our focus. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. John, the beloved disciple, who emphasizes love in the Gospel of John in 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, comes to us and he challenges us. And he says, love has to have loving actions. It's not just something in our head or our heart. It's something we do with our hands, with our lives, with our time, with our kindnesses. And he wants us to know real love comes with actions. It's not surprising that we find a similar sentiment in Jesus' half-brother, James. James writes about faith, but we could substitute the word love, and we'll do that in a second. And he emphasizes that faith without loving deeds isn't faith. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister was without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. Jesus had gotten through to his apostles and to his brothers, who were really his half-brothers, and made sure they knew what he was for them. The living, acting, working, full of deeds, love of God sent to express that love. Now we can go into James' statement and replace faith with the word love. And notice how it applies. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have love but has no deeds? Can such love save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is that love? In the same way, love by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have love. Well, I have deeds. You show me your love without deeds, and I will show you my love by my deeds. Yeah, this switch of words is not me messing with Scripture. It's illustrating a point That is God's point. It's something He wants us as believers today to grab a hold of and put in our hearts. That love without action isn't love. It's just not. And how do I know? I know because, first of all, God demands it. That's our verse of the day. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Now, the verse that precedes it is just like James 2. I want you to look at that verse. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? That's pretty much identical to what James says in James 2. Love must demonstrate itself. God demands it. But I know a second reason that this is true, and that is God displays it. In fact, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. For God so loved the world. He doesn't just say He loves the world. He says, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. He sent His Son into our world, not to condemn the world, but to save the world. God demands it, and God displays it. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. This is how God showed His love among us. He sent His one and only Son into the world that we might live through Him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. God demands it and God displays it. Love must be shown. It must be demonstrated in actions. And if we're honest with ourselves, if you've been a churchgoer or a follower of Jesus for a long time, it's easy to get lost in just words. Well, I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor, and I try to love my neighbor. And that's an easy thing to say, isn't it? I love my neighbor. Because we know that's one of the two great commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But loving our neighbor is not easy. And the reason I know it's not easy is because Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan to emphasize what loving a neighbor is. And the very best of Jewish religion walks by on the other side while the suffering man lies there near death. And we can give all sorts of excuses. They were on their way to Jerusalem. They didn't want to become unclean, whatever. That's the point. Jesus says they didn't love their neighbor because they didn't do anything to help their neighbor. It didn't matter if they were afraid of bandits. Pat could have been afraid of this woman being part of a scheme to take advantage of her. After all, she was a widow. Pat could have just dropped the lady off, but instead she walked her to the apartment, helped her carry her groceries, met her family. That was a dangerous place at one time in that city until it had been cleaned up and made ready for refugees. And these people didn't speak English. It'd been easy for her to take the priest and Levite stance in the Good Samaritan parable and walk by on the other side and ignore the needs of the man on the ground because of fear or because of religious wanting to not associate with ugly or vile things. But Jesus points to a Samaritan, someone many Jews would have called a dog, and he becomes the hero of the story because God demands it and God displays it. Real love acts in loving, kind ways. Now, it's also easy for us to say, and I've had this said to me, well, I just live by the golden rule. I remember trying to talk to someone about faith once. And he said, oh, don't bother me with that stuff. I live by the golden rule, and Jesus taught that. And I wanted to say, so that's why you drive like a maniac, cut people off, and flip them the finger. That doesn't seem like living by the golden rule to me. That's why you cut in the other day when this little old lady couldn't find a handicap spot, and you took the parking place because she was hesitating. That's not living by the golden rule. Living by the golden rule is living like Jesus did. loving others more than our own comfort, loving others more than our security. It's easy to say I live by the golden rule, but really, do we? Because after all, we're called to live love to a broken world. Now, it's time for us to have a little come to Jesus meeting, those of us who claim to be people of faith. Because people don't reject Jesus largely because they don't believe in him, or they think he was a bad guy, or they think he was a myth. Yeah, I know there are those with objections, scientific objections, and cynical objections. But the real reason most people in our culture, in our world, reject Christianity is because of people who claim to be Christians. The world doesn't reject Jesus because they think he's mean, ugly, untrue, a myth, but because those claiming to follow him are way too often unloving, unkind, combative, and just downright mean. If we as Jesus followers are rude, ugly, assuming, presuming on others, pushy, if we assume that we're right and everybody else is wrong and going to hell in a handbasket, and we treat them that they deserve that, why in the world would people want to follow the Jesus we claim to follow? I pause there for a minute to let us think about that, because it's crucial. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Yes, the focus in John's message is on loving each other as brothers and sisters, and Jesus was right. They'll know you're my disciples by your love for each other. But Jesus also wants us to love all people, just like Pat did. And I'm thankful she loved them, because I got to personally study and baptize 47 of those precious people. Folks I'll spend eternity with. And it was glorious. So I want to challenge you that Jesus wants us to love with actions and in truth all people, because we want them to be friends eternally. Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. And how do we do that? We give tangible support for basic needs. We help people when they're struggling. And we do it even though some of them will take advantage of us. We offer emotional support for broken hearts. We go to the hospital and sit with them. We sit with them as they grieve. We check on them as they mourn. We do little acts of service, go to the grocery or mow the lawn to help them when things are difficult and support them emotionally. We send them cards from time to time. We remember the date when they lost a loved one. These are all ways that we can support each other and God's family and those in our neighborhood that don't know Jesus, and show that our love is in actions and in truth. We offer faithful intercessory prayer. We don't leave it at prayer, but prayer is crucial and important. God, we want you to open this person's heart and give us eyes to see how we can best reach them with your grace. Father, help their child overcome COVID. Be with them as they go through this time of job loss, and help them be open to letting us share meals with them. And then fourth, we do simple acts of kindness for their everyday struggles. I will never forget a waitress in a restaurant, and that restaurant was full of religious people all the time. But unbeknownst to us, one of my co-ministers and one of my elders who regularly went in there befriended one of the waitresses. She had been an alcoholic. She had destroyed her family. She had shamed herself. She had committed adultery. And it was in a small town, and everybody knew, and she was destroyed by it. She looked hard, worn, and put away, a mess. But each of us in our different meetings knew her name, began to collect prayer requests, and it was a glorious opportunity when she said, "Phil, could you get Van and Dan to come to breakfast one morning?" and pray for me. I'm clean, I'm sober, and you have reminded me that God's people love folks who are lost. And I need your prayers and support as I move back to town, knowing they're going to still view me as the old me. But I've got to go back, make some amends, and draw close to my daughters. And she did. Why? Because we tipped her a little more. Because we remembered her names and her daughters' names. We remembered key things about her struggle. It wasn't hard. It was just simply being a good neighbor to a neighbor we loved and living by the golden rule. Let's remember that love always demonstrates its power, its reality, not just with words, but with actions and in truth. God bless you as you love others this week.